Good morning, good evening, good day, greetings with a helping side of. Welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Waddy, and I am joined today by the marvelous Mr. Mischievous himself, Russ. How's it going?
Good. How are you doing? Definitely can't dispute the mischievous, but not in like an evil way, like a fun way.
Yeah, we should put that on the tagline of a cereal box. Mischievous in a good way.
Mischievous, but in a fun way.
Oh, thank you and for joining us today. As always, we have another fun show planned today about a little bit of S3 security. But before we dive into that, if this is your first time joining, let us reintroduce ourselves the proper way. So, my name is Tristan Waddy. I come to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to cloud in a secure manner, fashion, form, and way. And Russ, where are you coming from?
I come from the security incident response team. We help customers with security events that generally will lead to incidents and help you contain and mitigate.
I would say that's mischievous in the bad way, right? Those ones that you try to mitigate.
Yeah, no, I try to help help get rid of the bad mischievous and the good mischievous.
Yes.
I feel like I've said that word so many times now that it feels weird.
Yeah, 100%. But what doesn't feel weird is asking, where is everybody tuning in from, dialing in from, listening from? We would like to know. So feel free to let us know. And as always, we kind of always have, let's say, two questions, two items that we like to open our show with. So the second one is going to be a fun one. Would you rather fall asleep instantly every night but never drink coffee or tea again, or eat whatever you want with zero health consequences, but always struggle with sleep? Russ, this is an interesting one. Which way do you go with this?
I'm gonna go with eat whatever I want, and that's an easy one for me. If there's anything you need to know about me, it's I eat. I like to eat. I can't sleep now anyway, so what's little extra sleep struggles,
Yeah, and it's interesting when you mentioned food. Imagine eating any food, and if you would like to participate in the chat, let us show a poll in the top right hand corner of the screen. Feel free to put one or two as your comment as we dive into this. And while you do this, we also want to say hello, producer Jeff. How's it going? And
Producer Jeff.
Right? That's another theme song we would say. I would come up with, right, producer Jeff? But yep. I think there's a good part. I have a kid already, so struggle with sleep, so I might as well eat what I want. That is a good point right there. Right? I think as we start to...
Now, real quick question.
Yeah.
Is this the sort of thing where you're like, ooh, I can eat uranium and get like those 50 that like... Is that the sort of thing where you can just start eating weird craziness? Zero health consequences, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of the funny thing is, where do you categorize, being unwell? Right? Like, where does existing start and stop, right? Those are the kind of questions we ask ourselves when you think of zero health consequences. Well, technically you don't. This goes down a rabbit hole. But what doesn't go down a rabbit hole is us talking about security of the S3 variety. So always feel free to continue to answer the questions after we speak about it. But I think today's topic is an interesting one. But before we dive into it, Russ, where did we come from last week?
Well, last week we went over, last week was our episode on, I got to bring up the title. I wasn't prepared this week. The circle is closing, enhancing your AWS data perimeter. That was last week's episode. You do not need to have watched it to understand or follow along with this episode. We try to keep them as modular as possible. And so this week is going to be our up, down, encrypt, block episode. And I'll let you figure out what the theme is on this one.
Yeah, it's kind of mysterious, right? But if you do get this reference, 10 billion points to you. And producer Jeff is on the move. Producer Jeff is on the loose. I get this reference, and I kind of wonder how many other people do. But not to dive into that age range, I think today's topic, 4 potential areas we want to delve into, right? If we were to keep the theme of the video game variety up, up, down, down, left, right, is the known code of a certain, let's say, gaming series, franchise, depending on how you look at it. And what we wanted to do is dive into it from an AWS spin, right? Encrypt, block, specifically to S3. But in order to understand, let's say policies with S3, you have to be able to select which character you want. And what I mean by that is there's a variety of different ways to lock down S3 from a policy perspective. And what we're trying to do is get to a point of, hey, what is the known best practices way to lock down S3? So that we don't get to the point where something may be public that's not supposed to be public, or something may be authorized that someone else shouldn't be, let's say, viewing, reading any of those API calls. And then how do we encrypt these items so we don't have things like, somebody listening in or somebody trying to access sensitive information types? We always hear about encryption. And do we want to speak about the server-side encryption using KMS? We may want to do that. But where we want to go to is also understanding that securing S3 is almost like a co-op game. Co-op, why is it co-op? Well, you're trying to design your S3 policies, particularly around, let's say, other AWS services. So you're trying to work with other AWS services and not necessarily work against them, right? So that's where the co-op piece comes in. Because you can easily put together a policy that has a bunch of denies and do not access. And then when you try and do, let's say, backups, denied and doesn't work, right? You're trying to do some type of logging for your incident response overall workflow. You don't have the policies. Something may not work properly. You may not get those logs into your bucket. And then once you figure this out, you can figure out how to stack the different layers of power-ups with native controls and kind of use that concept of defense in depth that we like to speak about, right? And as we go into it, funny opening. I would agree, but then I would be biased. So, see, I get Russ to laugh a couple of times to kick off the show. It's always a fun task or goal or side quest. But I digress. So I think the place we want to start today is with a simple poll. And what is that poll? Well, which policy type do you think causes the most unexpected S3 access denials in your organization? Russ, what have you seen? What have you heard? What have the customers shown to you?
So I'd say based off of the number of types of cases, I'm going to go with number 2. Yeah. Yep. Here we got it right on there. Yeah, going to go with 2. IAM policies, especially if you're, doing it more small scale, you're doing the IAM policies yourself, who has access to what. I see that be the most common denominator as far as S3 permissions.
Yeah. I think 2 is a good choice with that, right? Because, bucket policies. I've worked with a lot of customers, and when it came to bucket policies, that always seemed to be the place where people tripped up the most, just kind of understanding the order of operations. Because when it comes to service control policies, one of the key pieces is, hey, what are your baseline policies within your organization? And that's the way to think of service control policies. They're the first line of defense to just taking that original, let's say, allow, deny, foundational. But then as you get into more specific services, that's where something like the bucket policies really come into play, right? So let's just touch upon that a little bit more, right? So when you think of, let's go back to that metaphor of selecting your character. Do you understand or have an inkling of understanding the different policies that go into S3, right? Because before you can win the game, you need to know pretty much every character on the field, right? And this starts with understanding the S3 API requests and how it goes through policy evaluation, right? And that is a key item. And New also asked the question of what kind of conflict in policies. Yes, that is a good item to also jump into because you could have bucket policies where you say, "Hey, I allow this user," but if you trace back through the policy itself, maybe you're not really allowing that user, you're denying the user, or vice versa, right? Depending on your SCPs, depending on your identity, how the resources are accessing, where they're accessing from, right? Is it a service with a human role or is it a machine role, right? These are all, I would say, pieces of the puzzle that you try and get to. So I think part of this is understanding the initial flow. And there's actually policy evaluation logic that you can go through to understand, to see and map through every layer, right? You have your SCPs, your RCPs, your permission boundary, session policies, and identity-based policies, right? And one more thing, bucket policy. You see how complicated that could get if you don't have the understanding of the workflow of how to get through it, right? Russ, what have you seen from your side when it comes to kind of how these policies all flow together and how sometimes customers, think they're covered here, but it doesn't really apply?
Yes, definitely. Like we were saying earlier with the conflicting policies, a lot of the times, those policies are very much, deny default. So if you're basically cut off at one part, like you don't have access. And so, for example, things like, resource, policies causing, or trying to give access to someone, but SEPs or maybe even user permissions that don't grant you access to maybe S3 or S3 read or write. So lots of things like that. But also, having these in place, but then having overly permissive in one area. So you see that a lot with credential exposures because they have to gain access somewhere. They're unlikely to gain that access. They're most likely to gain that access rather through credentials or some sort of IAM, gaining access through IAM, most likely. And so those things, once they have access, it's like, okay, did they limit the scope at all of this? Or is this like, wow, this person has admin permissions and can get everywhere and do everything? That's going to be a bad day, And so it's like, if you know what, is granting you actual permissions, and then what is, taking those permissions and mostly guiding them, like SCPs, more so than granting permission, or is just controlling that permission. And so that's kind of how they work together, and also how they can be, mismatched. So if you're, putting all of these, extremely, well-defined policy logic and everything, but then oops, you forgot about all of your resource policies, and a key pair, accidentally got exposed. Now they have direct access, so it's little things like that where, you're allowing the attacker to get around your defense in depth. And that's why this is so critical that they all line up,
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned a key component of this as well is figuring out kind of what the ceiling is when it comes to policy evaluation logic, right? So SCPs and RCPs, those are going to be your ceiling components, right? So a deny at the org level is going to override every policy below it, essentially, right? So when you start to get into understanding that, now you start to look into, okay, well, how do I define an SCP, right? And what are the maximal permissions that we're allowing the IAM principles within that account? So once you start to go through that process, now you can say, okay, I have the understanding of the ceiling. Now, how can I do that to the individual principles? So permission boundaries start to come into play. And with permission boundaries, let's say a role can have S3, let's say wildcard. We don't like to just throw out wildcard. I suggest you have the individual items in there. But if you deny this, right, within the permission boundary, now you start to see how it can be effective within your overall defense in depth approach or strategy. So these are all pieces of the puzzle that you start to kind of go through and understand one piece at a time. And I think another, I was going to say, wild card we should throw in there is just understanding bucket policies as a whole as one piece of the puzzle. So what we can jump into just to kind of chat about bucket policies is, let's say, the documentation for bucket policies, which is a strong place to start. And why I say that is you start to go through understanding how the resource works at a fundamental level when it comes to understanding bucket policies and how to add bucket policies. And the reason why we're staying so long on this topic is because, hey, it's important to understand the ceiling, but once you get towards the middle, it's also part of the puzzle to understand how the individual resource itself works. And that's what we're trying to get across with kind of the deep dive into the section, right? You could do it through the console, but suggest IAC. But going back, you could do it a couple different ways, right? And the reason why we say that, IAC, you can have some more additional permission and guardrails to say, hey, not anybody who has console access can just make a bucket policy. You can define your limits and define, hey, if I'm using LZA, the only thing that can make changes is the LZA pipeline or something along those lines, right? That's why we kind of go through that process. Another interesting thing is using VPC endpoint from kind of the networking layer, right? So they can block access even when IAM and bucket policy both allow. So this is going through that defense in depth approach that we were mentioning and kind of understanding what the overall flow is, right? Because a VPC gateway endpoint for S3 can have an endpoint policy attached to it that filters the traffic through that endpoint specifically. And the use case for this is usually to restrict only, let's say, specific access to buckets within your organization and not allowing anybody from anywhere to access it, right? When you start to get into leveraging endpoint policies. This is a way to kind of close off the loop itself. Because one of the pieces that we're trying to get to is preventing data exfiltration, which will cause a bad day and a call to us, right? And how do we avoid that? Well, we leverage all these various mechanisms. Russ, what do you say kind of is the next step after you understand the policies? What is kind of the next layer of thing?
Yeah, so I think policies are going to be, kind of your, definitely at least your entry level. You've got to learn your policies. If we go back to our, video game reference, we need to know what our attacks look like, I guess you could say. And, our SCPs and RCPs are going to be our primary ways of doing that. And so the next step, I think, is going to be, putting those together, moving from weapons to loadouts. And so how things kind of, stack together to make something stronger. So we're going to go back to the KMS piece a little bit, the server-side encrypted KMS. So KMS encryption doesn't just protect data at rest. It's also can be, another gate that you can basically keep out, another gate point for S3 and IAM policies. So things like things like locked out objects, cross account access that doesn't work as as defined. Basically, teams that aren't using KMS properly. So as we're talking about data exfiltration, encryption is going to be our secret weapon, if you will. So for example, let me just get into an example. Every get object triggers a KMS decrypt or decryption event. And then every put object triggers a generate data key. And so you have to be authorized not just in the get object, which is the S3 API call, but you also have to be authorized for the KMS call, which is the decrypt. So get object and decrypt. So it's like another gate on top of your actual S3. And so if you are able to actually say generate data key or have access to that key, it adds that additional verification, additional level of you are the person that you say you are, and you are able to access these things. And here is your KMS key that allows that to actually occur. So it's kind of like KMS keys or key policies are kind of like the root of trust. If the key doesn't actually grant or delegate access, then there's no, IAM alone can't override that, because IAM is granting, but the key policy is what you need to actually activate those permissions. Because without the key, it's an automatic deny. You're not going to have the ability to do that, which remove that KMS, and you don't have access to anything if you don't have that key. So it's kind of like that, that scoped access, that you can customize within KMS to be a little bit more customizable, but also a little bit more in the background, because AWS services are using those KMS keys, but you have to actually be able to access those in order to basically make any type of mutable change within the account. So it's not just providing that level of almost like a second layer of authentication, sort of, but just for permissions and the scoping of what you're actually able to do as a user versus what you're not able to do. And so yes, S3 bucket keys can reduce KMS API calls by up to 99%, but change CloudTrail logging from object level to bucket level for KMS events. And that's important because of CloudTrail logging. CloudTrail logging does not log, the data plane, just the control plane. So instead of, service level, it goes object level to bucket level. So that's also of note.
Yeah.
But
so really quick, I think part of the piece that I always like to look at, especially when it came to the KMS piece, is S3 is a storage locker, KMS is a locksmith, right? So you think of your S3 bucket as a safe deposit vault at a bank. You can store anything inside the vault. The bank has controls, who can walk through, let's say, your bucket policy. But then let's say, everything within inside that vault has its own padlock. And that's where the locksmith KMS comes into play, right? Just to set that analogy into play, because when you start to go through KMS, you're like, okay, I have KMS, but I also have these layers of identity and policies and things of that nature. So you have your storage locker within your vault. You have the KMS as the individual that can go in and access those, let's say, specific vault pieces, right? or the padlocks on those. But sorry, not to interrupt.
Oh no, that's perfect. It's a good analogy for sure. I think it's also maybe you can also explain a little bit about why we'd want that level of granularity.
Yeah, because you always want, let's show this right here, right? So if you look at the S3 authorization flow as a whole, right, you have your explicit deny, which is your org level SCPs, RCPs, resource-based, identity-based, permission boundaries, and this is not all. It goes to session policies, right? So this is the policies itself. But now what you want to look at is we go back to our analogy of, okay, these are the policies, but the actual padlock on each one of those vaults should have another mechanism that needs to be unlocked by a third party or third resource, right? So if one team controls the door, another team controls the locks. So neither one alone can grant full access to your items, because if you think of the bank vault, you think of the crown jewels and the valuable stuff. To me, it might be a video game or something like that inside, but I digress. These are things that you want to have when it comes to that two locks with two different key holder mentality, right? That's how you want to have those separation of duties when it comes to this. Because if you had a policy, let's say from identity standpoint, that, hey, this person has full access, so they're able to just view everything, that's not always the best thing to have in place, right? Some other items is, okay, you may want somebody to have access to view the items in the S3 bucket, but not necessarily decrypt or have sensitive access, information access, something along those lines, right? So stay in the pursuit, put one in there, because that is the first step. So we are just going through and adding these items in, right? Because we're trying to help you understand kind of from the perspective of how KMS works together with your policies. Pick one of those as some of the first steps to go through, right? Because within your KMS policies itself, you can also grant, let's say, temporary scope to access without changing the key policy itself. These are all specific items that you need to have consideration for when you have something like S3 security. So, Russ, when we get back to kind of the understanding of the fundamentals, right? Not to go too much into KMS in this episode, but I think part of this is understanding kind of the history, the background, the legends. If you saw that coming, 10 billion points to you. That's where we dive into as SideQuest Legend has it, which is a segment within our show when we kind of put on, let's say, some ambient music of the SideQuest and variety, and we start to discuss a customer story. And with that customer story, what is it? Well, it's a deep dive into, let's say, a fictitious, loosely based, somewhat reoccurring theme when it comes to different customer items and stories. And what we have to tell that story is our SideQuest board, which is that physical representation that we can move our pieces around. So if we think of a SideQuest for today, I would say Vault Quest would be a good name to go by for our fictitious company that's based out of, let's just say, Colorado. Right? We'll pick on Colorado. We like to go around the different states. And imagine that they're a video game company. They have a massive multiplayer online RPG platform. They have a lot of users who are authenticated, but there may be some unauthenticated users that have access to view certain things within their programs. And they're rapidly growing, which is often the case, where they may have something like 97 studios. Why not 100? Well, we'll get to that in the story. So if you think about it, they have a rapidly growing RPG platform. Maybe they have something like 42 million players on this platform. So you can imagine they're pretty much all around the globe. They said they have SCPs to prevent individuals from disabling systems like CloudTrail. They have permission boundaries, but something still happened within their organization. And what they did see was a lot of their code start to pop up in various places. and they're wondering how this happened within their environment. Where did the exfiltration come from? Well, after investigation, they delved in and found some gaps within their SCPs and their permission boundaries. And as the music drops a little bit more, we start to think about what were those gaps? How could they have prevented it? Well, I was going to say find out in the next episode, but we can find out right now. So I think what they're trying to get to is a solution. And Russ, the question I pose to you in our story as we start to weave it is, when does an organization usually notice their security gaps? How do they not see them coming?
Well, let's go with how do they usually find out? Usually when those gaps are exploited, which is what Tristan was going for. But usually it's extremely difficult to be able to determine every single gap. I mean, you have a gap just for not knowing what you don't know. Like, there's a gap with you not knowing all of your gaps. So it can be very difficult to be able to, not have any, if we're going to go back to our castle structure real quick, not have any weak bricks within that castle wall. It's extremely difficult to find every single one and make sure they're all sturdy. That's why we, push for less manual options, so that way there aren't those little human mistakes. But they inevitably do happen. And you have to basically be on constant lookout, which is why, cybersecurity can be such a tough job and, can lead to.
But I have public lambdas. Why? My lambdas are outside of the VPC and they do things. Is that a bad thing? Or is it a good thing?
Well, we can go ahead and call that a purely bad thing based on our situation. We don't want unauthorized users to be able to access things they're not supposed to be. So not to say that all, like public buckets, are bad. That's something that is used for. But, once we start looking at things like lambdas and, your internal structure, you don't really want to publicize any of that.
Yes.
Oops.
And as we start to unwind and kind of take the step back, because usually what happens is something occurs and everybody's tensions go up to how do we close, how do we solve this? And what we need to get back to is our target state security strategy, where we dive into kind of, hey, some of the things that could lead to this, right? Because within your code base, are you taking a copy of production data and backing up to S3 bucket? Because, hey, anybody can do so. Are there resource org ID conditions anywhere within there? If an auditor asks, can you provide, your regulated data strategy or data classification or things along those lines, can we do that? And these are the questions that we start to ask, along with who had the rights to do so. And usually what this brings into the conversation of, let's look through the logs to see who did something that they weren't supposed to do. And slowly you learn, as you expand the story out a little bit more, is that usually there was an identity item or issue that occurred because somebody had, let's say, overprivileged access. And I know you're saying, hey, we have key management, we have a KMS service, but one of the things that you won't see the arrow point to directly is like, okay, this person has this access to those keys as well. And the reason why we call that out is the separation of duties item, right? When you have developers from junior to senior to principal to whatever level, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate access conditions, which in our use case today, it sounds like they did not have, along with the proper automations in place. And Russ, I think one piece of this, if they had sensitive data within their buckets, let's get rid of that Lambda because we're not supposed to have public Lambdas outside the VPC. How were they supposed to search for sensitive data within their buckets?
Yeah, Well, there's a couple things about that. So it could be as simple as just labeling properly and documenting, documentation, or you could find out the hard way.
Yeah. And the other piece of that is if you don't want to find out the hard way, you can leverage something like Amazon Macy, right? Sensitive information, copy of production items in there. So what you start to build out and kind of realize is, hey, in order for us to have the correct mechanisms in place to say, hey, there's a call to our S3 to, let's say, unencrypt our data and transfer it somewhere else. Well, there's supposed to be a bunch of systems in place, like guard duty, for instance, that says, hey, there's a sensitive event occurring. Is this allowed by this user? And it got picked up in the logs over here, right? These are all pieces of the puzzle you need to consider. So when you're thinking of the different layers, if we think of from an identity perimeter, hey, do we have something like principal org ID conditions to ensure that identities belonging to our fictitious company VaultQuest is configured properly, right? There's no misconfigurations, so that somebody outside of the organization can, just change access or have no access at all, right? That's what we're trying to get to within this scenario, right? And then we have a question from the whispers in the audience. Is the S3 bucket publicly accessible? That is a great question. And these are the pieces that you need to consider as well. So thank you for staying the pursuit, because if the bucket needs to be publicly accessible or not depends on the use case for the organization. So if you have something like Macy, it can detect if it's public, but it's up to the organization itself to say, hey, what data is inside that S3 bucket? I'm assuming if it has sensitive information, shouldn't be publicly accessible at all. It should have the block public access on by default and not allow any changes. And that's where some of our condition keys start to come into play a little bit more, right? So you don't want anybody outside changing that, as well as anybody inside having the ability to do so as well. So thank you for that. And also, some more solutions to our little bit of a mess here is we want to get to a point where everything kind of looks streamlined, right? Where we have an event occur or an API call is captured in CloudTrail. Hey, what are the users accessing? What are the API calls from that? Okay, do we have something to say, this is a suspicious call in place? And then what we can add is maybe a little bit of a step function into play to say it's not such a clean connection, right? So if there's automation logic in place to say, okay, this is a normal occurrence, allow this action to take place, then you start to have that layer of defense in depth as well as automation that we were speaking about. So, Russ, when it comes to this, I would say, what is one of the important takeaways from this board outside of we need to organize a little bit better? Right?
Yeah, I think the real takeaway for me is look at how many steps that has to go through. Look at how many different layers you have to peel back, and that's the whole philosophy behind defense in depth. Is an attacker coming in, peeling layer after layer, and just giving up essentially. I'm gonna go look for easier prey elsewhere, easier targets of opportunity, especially with most cybercrime. It's usually smash and grab type of attacks that we're dealing with essentially, especially when you're talking about like ransomware, which is also super important when it comes to S3. It really is quite important, and that's why you want to be able to add layer after layer after layer, to really make it very frustrating to be able to get to anything worthwhile. So for me, it's just demonstrating how important it really is to have all of these different layers and why we do add all of those different layers.
Yes, and different services. And I think that brings up the good old pause game button that we need to do with this as well, right? So if we hit the good old Zach Morris timeout and kind of take a step back from exactly what Russ was saying, is we need to understand each of the layers as well as the services that go with each one of those layers, right? So if we were to go a little bit deeper into the topic of, hey, how do we secure S3 with, let's say, something like a data perimeter? Well, that works with AWS services, not against them. I think that's the theme that we're trying to get to, right? Is how do we work with S3 and other AWS services that doesn't contradict each other, right? Because the hardest part, if we take it back to the video game analogy of playing a co-op game, is making sure not to hurt your teammates. What we're trying to apply is this concept across all the different, let's say, pillars, right? The data perimeter pillar, the identity of the resource, right? These are some of the key aspects to understanding how we can better secure our S3. And a lot of this boils down to a couple of areas, right? Do we understand principal org ID, resource org ID, source VPC, and principal AWS service, right? And how these are implemented within our organization. We keep going back to kind of SCPs as a whole, just because service control policies, right, and resource control policies, they're an important part of that ceiling that we were speaking about. So that ceiling is, hey, if we are trying to control our data perimeter, we want to make sure that nothing can go outside of our perimeter, or calls from other organizations to get something outside is met with a swift deny, right? And I think where we want to go with this is understanding, okay, if we look at the identity perimeter as one of those pieces, the principal org ID is a key aspect of that, right? Because it ensures that only your org's principals get in. That's part of it. But this can also, let's say, affect other AWS services depending on how you implement it into your environment. Because as you're aware, there's some global services, there's some regular services, right? So you need to understand how everything kind of ties together. Right? And what we're also trying to avoid is, I would say, the confused deputy scenario, right? That's another popular piece where you have a compromised third-party service attempting to access your S3 buckets and its own credentials, and then how do you have your policy set up? Or if it's a legit case, that can also be one of the key aspects to understanding. And what I mean by legit case is, hey, I want this service to be able to do something with my S3 for logging, for data, whatever the case may be, and it's not able to do that. So these are some of the key pieces that we need to understand, because I would say, how much of your percentage is stemmed from identity cases and kind of S3 data exfiltration, right? Like if you think about your numerous years and tenure and things of doing that, if you were to put percentages around it, what do you think is the percentage around that, Ross?
For S3 permissions, I'd say probably a good like 10%.
Yeah.
It's fairly significant.
Yeah. And to put that in context, 10%, just think of how many tickets you could do in a week. And each ticket is a case, right? And that can be thousands and thousands and thousands of different scenarios like that. And it's oftentimes a simple configuration tweak, right? Saying, hey, don't allow anything outside of my organization using this policy. And then you apply that appropriately. And now, hey, it's done, right? So the other piece of this is making sure that you have something like your resource org ID, that call, right? That prevents accidental data leakage to public buckets, right? Or misconfigurations across, let's say, cross-account sharing, which is another piece of the puzzle that, is spoken about, but isn't spoken about a lot when it comes to designing, because it's like, oh, I have all these accounts and then you could just share. Well, how are you configuring this within your environment? That's another important piece of the puzzle, right? Because I've seen organizations when they're having discussions around cross account accesses, usually, hey, we're going to have an account. Let's dive into this a little bit, right? So I've had conversations with customers that are looking for the proper way to segment to meet data residency requirements. And where does that go? It's like, oh, we'll just have an account per, per location. And then, okay, we're done. But how do you handle that in a large scale, right? Because once you leave the account, now you have to perform other mechanisms and make sure everything's secure, because you know what is shared sometimes. Hey, how is our centralized logging happening with our third-party integrations? Oh, we'll just open access to. Well, then if you open access, what policies do you have in place, right? And do they account for all the different scenarios, opposed to having, let's say, an account with the different regions built into it, right? And then it's everything within the same account, and then you can have the appropriate guardrails in place. Because what you start to get into is those conversations of cross account access. And I know Russ is kind of laughing inside his head just because it's just like, I've been
yeah,
having those conversations.
Yes, and it does happen, and you do have to dig through, excuse me, all of those permissions and find out where things went, a little bit wrong. Yeah, it can be, extremely tedious, which is again why you also don't want to do it by hand, and why you want to do some sort of, IAC.
Yes, and I think that also brings up our next question of, let's take a poll from the audience, right? When it comes to, let's say, your security power-ups, right? Specifically relating to S3, which S3 security power do you think is the most commonly skipped or forgotten about in production? So we have a wide range, 1 through 5. Feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 5 inside of the chat. But as I look at this, Russ, which way are you leaning first?
I wanted to say 5, just because, how many times I've seen, someone not be able to restore their account after ransomware. But I'm going to say that that's maybe the most impactful thing. But I think what is just the most commonly skipped or forgotten, I think it's definitely going to be number 3. Is enabling data events, which is huge. It's every time you go and look at S3, you have to decide, is this supposed to happen? Not even entirely sure without logs what did happen. So it's hard to tell what was supposed to happen and versus what actually did happen if you don't have those logs.
Yeah. And as Stay in the Pursuit says, that was a blind guess. You know what? It's interesting because each one of these are plausible. But to Russ's point is how you're looking at it. Because enable AWS CloudTrail, Amazon S3 data events. This is often a conversation that we have as well as we're starting to build out the design for any type of environment, right? Is this enabled? And usually the case is not enabled, right? And to Ari's question, if there's a tick box to turn something on, I feel like there would be most skipped. I forget the little tick boxes all the time. Yes, I would agree with that. It's like, okay, if it's enabled, then it's enabled. So I think this question also stems back to when you look at it from usually the cost perspective is this an additional cost that we have to account for? And then you start to balance that conversation of, hey, is it worth it to have this on? And then Russ would say yes. But somebody from, let's say, that deals with the cost component is like, well, maybe we don't need to have that because we have something else. And then you don't notice there's a gap until a later time. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to have that full stack of defense. And you might not know everything when it comes to a specific service or how does it allow this or where all the check boxes are. That's why we often suggest the certificate knowledge. or diving in with us every week for our knowledge quest. And I know, what is a knowledge quest? Glad you asked. So the knowledge quest is a segment of our show where we dive into some pieces of articles where you can, hey, review, you can look into, you can kind of share with us and say, hey, I learned something from this article. We'd love to know. Always feel free to reach out to us. But I think another piece of it is it allows you to build some aura, right? When it comes to the security variety. We like to say that because you just feel when somebody's diving into an article or a concept, you just feel this aura of like, hey, they know what they're speaking about. They're not at an L100 layer right now, which we would say, hey, in this case is...
But it's okay if you are.
Yes, exactly. A button masher. You know why? Because it's fun to be a button masher sometimes. It's like, hey, I'm diving in. I'm just trying to learn everything. This is a cool concept. So the best way to be said button masher is diving into... yeah, it's a good place to be, right? Because you can dive into everything. You're not limited on where you're going, right? Because you want to dive into a condition key. Okay, what are condition keys? And this is something we were speaking about earlier of understanding, hey, what are the properties of principal? What are properties of role session? So on and so forth, right? Another thing that you start to look at is you dive deeper into what are the ways to implement said topics. So if we were to look at this JSON, it's like, okay, what am I doing here with a principal account? Well, use this key to compare which request in principal belongs with account identifier. If this sentence seems foreign to you, then that's okay, because you could dive into the examples. You can play around with them. You're a button masher, right? You're just trying out these different items within your test environment to say, okay, let me take this snippet of code, see how it applies, and keep going from there. And then playing around with SCPs, preferably at one of the test OU or experimental OU pieces, for the fact that you don't want to lock yourself out or do anything along those lines. But
you're not recommending that you test in production. Okay, not recommending that at all.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you're testing, it's good to test in experimental OU just for those reasons, so that eventually you become a little bit of like, hey, this SCP goes with this goes with that, and you start to chain together some combos. Some may say you're a combo chainer. And if we're using our video game analogy of the up, down, down piece, is I know when to encrypt and block, right? How those fit together in a sentence that makes a little bit of sense. And then you can start to apply that to, hey, what makes sense from other combo chainers? What if other people did from a data perimeter aspect? Where have they delved into? And this is some of the pieces where you can delve into. Is like, okay, here's this one sample of the data perimeter where I'm examining my security objects. I'm understanding the boundaries, the resource identities, everything in between. And I can start to piece together a little bit more of the puzzle. And then I start to dive deeper into more examples and GitHub repos until eventually I become a speedrunner. And a speedrunner is, hey, you know all the basics and you know the specifics for all the different services that you're interacting with, right? You know how to leverage them in a certain way that makes sense to you. And that's where you can start to say, hey, I know how to use a VPC endpoint policy in a way that benefits my organization, especially from an S3 standpoint. And then you can also implement permission boundaries, because we spoke about SCPs, RCPs from that ceiling. Now, what comes after that? This is where you start to delve into permission boundaries a little bit, especially from an identity principle standpoint. And these are the fundamental steps that you can take some time and knowledge quest into. But the other piece I would suggest, as you start to go through, is to take those steps to test out and build up your experience points. Because we know when you start start looking at all of this and you hear it speak, the heartbeat starts to go a little bit faster, right? And it's like, okay, I think I know what's going on with this. But what we're trying to convey is once you take one step, you build up enough experience points to level up not only yourself, but your entire organization, because people start to dive in and think about, okay, what are they talking about? Because something like an SCP affects everybody. And if you never implement an SCP, if you do in a dev environment, you will find out from every developer what that SCP does, because you will have a ticket from every developer. And that's why we suggest testing within experimental OU, having a testing plan, doing the promotion process and everything along those lines. But it's like, hey, I want to create some security baseline SCPs within my environment. You start by testing it out, but you also start by the higher level concepts of, hey, I remember this encrypt, block thing. Let me dive into something what Russ mentioned, right? What Tristan mentioned, and kind of going from there. And don't worry, you can always, let's say, test things out. I'm using my words choice very specifically because SCPs are that ceiling, and you don't want to run headfirst into the ceiling. Russ is thinking about the logistics of that. It's like, how do I run into the ceiling? Well, implement SCP into production. You'll see how that comes to light. Russ, what is your one takeaway for this topic as a whole?
Well, now it's the scene in One Punch Man where he jumps up when he's doing the testing and then gets stuck in the ceiling. That's what I'm thinking now. But yeah, no, from this, your one takeaway should always be create an incident response plan, regardless. But from this, just take back the policies are your layers, okay? You want to make all of those layers like an onion, okay, and protect your critical information. I guess be an ogre is my advice. Ogres have layers.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Ogres are onion. 10 billion points to you if you get that reference at all. I think the vast majority of people may or may not, but I digress. What you should do is look into us every week as we continue to dive onto this conversation of, hey, what a data perimeter is, what security is, and how we can tie these analogies and metaphors to something of the video game variety or shape or form, right? And we'll throw in
whatever reference comes up to on our head at the top of the
exactly, right? So thank you for all of those who stuck with us as we kind of delved into the world of up, down, encrypt, block. And join us next week as we kind of continue the journey within this data perimeter discussion, right?
And also more tangents. That is a forever part of the journey. Yes. Branching off on tangents.
Tangents and going off the rails.
Always.
Right? And I would also add in side, little sound effects like the boing. So next
doesn't work on me anymore.
Yes. No? All right.
Now.
Drum roll. That always gets them. So until next week, take care. Have a fun one. Happy Monday. Have a great one. Thank you for joining.